With bated breath, Hare rode towards the gateway of the cliffs. Once he passed the corner of the wall, he breathed a sigh of relief. He urged his horse, Topper, to trot forward with a strange sense of elation. Hare had managed to leave the oasis undetected, and it would be morning before August Justice discovered his absence. Perhaps it would be even longer before Justice realized Hare's true intentions. This gave Hare's friend, Langford, a long head start. Hare shuddered at the thought of Justice's wrath, wondering how it would affect his plans. Langford envisioned Justice and his sons, along with the Navajos, in hot pursuit of him and the rustlers. However, Langford was determined to leave the future in the hands of fate and focus on the present. The strip of sand under the Blue Star had to be crossed at night, a feat that even the Navajos had not accomplished. Despite this, Langford was not afraid and pressed on. As he had been drawn to the painted desert by an inexplicable force, he was now urged forward by something nameless. The night was pitch black, and it felt like Langford was riding through a vaulted hall swept by a current of air. The night had turned cold, and the stars shone brightly while the rumble of the river had faded away. Suddenly, Topper's ringing trot turned into a noiseless, floundering walk. Langford realized they had reached the sand. He saw the Blue Star in the cliff and loosened the reins on Topper's neck. Topper stopped and champed her bit, turning her black head to Langford as if to ask for guidance. However, Langford had none to offer, so Topper stepped forward into the yielding sand. Langford sat at ease in the saddle, with his hands resting idly on the pommel. The rolling sand dunes glimmered in the faint starlight, their shadows stretching out into the darkness. As long as he could see the Blue Star, Langford knew which direction to go, but once it disappeared from view, he felt lost. Topper, his trusty horse, weaved a winding path through the dunes, ascending and descending small hills, turning sharply at gullies and zigzagging across flat stretches of sand that shone like glass. Langford had a hard time keeping track of where they were going, and at times it seemed like they were doubling back on themselves. The black cliffs in the distance seemed to move further away, and the stars slowly shifted in the sky until they disappeared below the horizon. But Topper never faltered. She knew exactly where they were going and was eager to get there. Langford breathed a sigh of relief when she finally snorted and stamped her hoof on a rock at the edge of the sand. They had made it across the treacherous dunes and were back on the trail. The rest of the journey was long and difficult, taking them over wind-carved rocks, through ridges of desert, and up a rough divide before finally descending towards the cedars. By the time they reached Silvercup Spring, the first light of dawn was starting to appear on the horizon. Langford dismounted and carefully wrapped Topper's hooves in buckskin pads to muffle the sound of their approach. He led her slowly through the cedars, being careful not to make any noise. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. With a sudden gasp, he caught sight of a campfire that had burned out. He moved carefully and quietly, like a skilled Indian scout. The sun began to rise over the red wall as he made his way to the trail beyond the spring. He avoided the curve of the valley and led his horse, Topper, up a wooded slope to a dense thicket of aspens in a hollow. The thicket surrounded a patch of grass, and he pushed aside the lithe aspens to let Topper graze freely. He took out his rifle and made sure Topper could not be seen or heard from below before he climbed the slope diagonally. He knew every inch of the ground and climbed quickly until he reached the mountain trail. He then descended and entered the cedars until he was directly above the cliff camp where he had spent many days. He knew this spot overhung the cabin built by Holderness. He moved from tree to tree and thicket to thicket, avoiding any noise. The sun rose over the red wall, and the mists in the valley began to move. Cattle were working their way towards the spring. Langford's senses became sharper with each step. The gray stone cliff below shut out the lower level of cedars. He listened for a moment before marking his course down the last bit of slanting ground to the cliff bench that faced the valley. This space was open and rough with crumbling rock and dead cedar brush, making it difficult to cross without making noise. He chose his steps deliberately and moved slowly with a stealth that satisfied even his intent ear. As he stared at the wide gray strip of stone in front of him, Langford's body trembled. He noticed a thick bush on the edge of the cliff just 3 steps away from where he stood. He crept towards it unseen and peered down at the campsite. A small cloud of smoke rose lazily, and he could hear the low voices of men in conversation, a merry whistle, and the humming of a tune. His mouth was dry and his temples throbbed as he tried to decide what to do. Suddenly the answer came to him as if it had been waiting just below the surface of his thoughts. "I'll watch until Holderness comes into sight, then jump up with a yell, give him time to draw his gun and kill him," he thought. Langford slipped into the bush, took a deep breath to calm his nerves, and peered over the cliff. He saw the crude shingles of the cabin, and beyond that a corral with a number of shaggy mustangs and a great gray horse. Langford stared in disbelief. He recognized the graceful wave of a white-crested mane and the proud arch of a splendid neck. "Silvermane, my God!" he gasped. "They caught him after all!" He fell backward onto the cliff, gripping his rifle tightly, trying to comprehend the meaning of what he had just seen. "Silvermane! They caught him after all!" he repeated, whispering in agony. Then, with a sudden realization, he whispered, "Mescal! Mescal!" He rolled onto his face, shutting out the blue sky. His body stiffened like a compressed spring released from its hold, and his nails dug into the stock of his rifle. Then he softened, and sobs shook him from head to foot. He sat up, looking haggard and wild-eyed. Silvermane had been caught, likely by rustlers lurking at the edge of the sandy strip. Mescal was now under the custody of Snap Justice, but Langford knew that Mescal was still alive and that Snap's days of wickedness were numbered. This was something that had to be done, and Langford felt a sudden surge of power and freedom, like a wild lion that had been set free from its captors. He peered over the cliff from behind a bush, watching the cabin that was only 200 feet away from his hiding spot. One of the rustlers sang as he tended to the campfire while the others waited for breakfast. Some of them got up, stretching and yawning as they put on their boots and headed for the spring. Snap Justice was the last to rise, having slept with his head on the doorstep of the cabin. Clearly he had Mescal captive inside, and no one could enter or exit without stepping on him. Langford observed all of this with a dark sense of humor. Holderness, the tall man with a gleaming gold-red beard, strolled around the cabin, whistling. Langford watched as the rustlers sat down for breakfast, speaking loudly and acting carefree. Snap Justice brought some food and coffee into the cabin before returning outside and closing the door. After breakfast, most of the rustlers went about their tasks, oblivious to Langford's watchful gaze. A group of men were lazily packing items while others made their way towards the corral. Holderness rolled a cigarette and reached for a burning stick from the campfire while Snap Justice paced back and forth in front of the cabin door. He was the only one who showed any restlessness, frequently glancing up the trail towards his father's oasis. Holderness sent expectant looks towards Seeping Springs, and at one point he spoke up saying, "I tell you, Justice, there's no hurry. We'll ride in tomorrow." Langford's mind was filled with questions. Why was Snap so anxious about the oasis trail? Was it because of the Navajos? Why wasn't Holderness in a hurry to leave Silver Cup? Why did he stay behind at the spring when he could have saved time by riding towards his ranch to meet his expected riders? Was he fearless or just playing a game? The rustlers were oblivious to the danger that lay beyond the divide. Would August Justice strike out on the White Sage Trail soon? Would he come alone or with his hard-riding Navajos? It didn't matter because he would be too late. Holderness's life was in danger, and Snap's gloom and nervousness showed his keen desert instincts. Had he harmed Mescal? Why was he guarding the cabin door so closely? As Langford watched and pondered, time flew by. Holderness was lounging around while Snap kept watch in silence. The rustlers were smoking, sleeping, and moving about. As the day progressed, the shadow of the cliff slowly crept over the cabin. Langford was surprised to find that the day had gone by in a flash, and the sun had already set behind Coconina. He wondered if August Justice had left the oasis at dawn and if he was nearing the divide by now. Langford eagerly awaited the arrival of the Navajos, hoping to see their dark mustangs gleaming in the red light as they swept down the ridge toward the cedars. He whispered to himself that if they came, he would kill Holderness, Snap, and anyone who tried to open the cabin door. Langford waited in tense watchfulness, his eyes alternating between the divide and the camp glade. He had been straining his ears all day to hear the rustlers' conversations. It suddenly occurred to him that if he climbed down through the split in the cliff to the bench where Dave and George had always hidden to watch the spring, he would be just above the camp. Although the descent involved some risk, he decided to venture down since it would enable him to see the cabin door when darkness set in. The rustlers were busy cooking dinner, unrolling blankets, and moving to and fro from the spring and corral, making it the perfect moment for him to climb down. Langford crawled back a few yards and along the cliff until he reached the split. It was a narrow, steep crack that he vividly remembered. Going down was risky, as he could easily lose his hold and possibly make some noise by rattling stones. However, he slipped downward with the gliding, sinuous movement of a snake and reached the grassy bench where he lay quietly. He could hear the rustlers' jesting voices and loud laughter from below, which reassured him. He had been lying low, carefully observing and listening to his surroundings from his new position. It provided him with the perfect opportunity to retreat quickly and quietly to the cedars. He crawled flat on the ground, making his way stealthily towards the bushy fringe of the bench. A bright fire illuminated the area under the cliff. Laughter and movement could be heard from the men gathered around the fire. The cabin door was wide open. Mescal was standing, leaning back from Snap Justice, trying to free her hands from the tight ropes that bound her. "Let me untie them," growled Snap. Mescal broke free from his grasp and stepped back. Her hands were tied in front of her, and she twisted them outward in self-defense. Her hair was disheveled, covering most of her dark eyes, which glared with intense hatred and defiance. She was like a little lioness, fierce and full of fight. "Fine, don't eat then starve," said Snap. "I'd rather starve than eat what you give me." The rustlers found this amusing. Holderness blew out a puff of smoke and smiled. Snap glared at Mescal and then at his accomplices, who all seemed to be on his side. One of them, a ruddy-faced man, walked towards Mescal. "Calm down, Snap, calm down," he said. "We can't let the girl starve. She hasn't even eaten yet. Here, miss, let me untie your hands. Hey, Justice, damn you, her wrists are black and blue." "Watch out, your gun!" yelled Snap. Mescal quickly grabbed the man's Colt from its holster, but Snap was faster and grabbed her arm before she could shoot. She winced and dropped the weapon. "You little Indian devil," exclaimed the rustler in awe of her. "I'm sorry I hurt you, and I'm even more sorry I ruined your aim. It wasn't very kind of you to throw my own gun at me right after I tried to be a gentleman, was it?" "I didn't mean to shoot you," panted Mescal. "If that's your excuse for treating your wife like that, then excuse me, Justice," said the Nebraska rustler with a hint of sarcasm. "I'm not denying that she's the most feisty and sweetest lady I've ever seen." "We Mormons don't discuss our women or listen to any talk about them," retorted Snap, his pale eyes dancing with fury. "You're from Nebraska?" "Yep, just a plain Nebraska rustler, cattle thief, and an all-around no-good customer. But I haven't started harassing women yet," replied the rustler calmly. In response, Snap slowly raised his right hand in a threatening gesture while his eyes glinted with anger. "Why do you want to pull a gun on me, Justice?" asked the rustler coolly. "Haven't you already shot enough of your friends? I don't really care whether you're a Mormon or not. I was just standing up for the lady who's got some guts, and I'll bet Holderness will back me up." "Snap, he's right," interjected Holderness smoothly. "You don't need to be so touchy about Mescal. She's made it clear that she's not interested in you. If you insist on treating her like a wild horse, at least be gentle about it. Let's eat supper. Mescal, you sit on the bench and behave yourself. I don't want you causing any trouble in my camp." Snap turned away angrily while Holderness served Mescal her food and drink. The rustlers sat around the campfire, eating in silence. For Langford, the scene was a whirlwind of emotions. He was overjoyed to see Mescal alive and unharmed, proud of her fighting spirit, and grateful to the Nebraska rustler. But at the same time, he had a deepening understanding of Holderness's schemes and a burning hatred for Snap Justice that he couldn't shake. With an unwavering determination to rescue Mescal, he waited patiently, even though he knew he had to exercise restraint. He clutched his rifle tightly, ready for action. As darkness fell, the rustlers finished their meal, and Mescal stepped out of the cabin. Snap swiftly approached her and ordered her to put out her hands to be tied up. Some of the rustlers protested, but the Mormon was not having any of it. He brandished his Colt, and the rustlers fell silent. Holderness laughed at the sight of the weapon. Snap proceeded to tie Mescal up, ensuring that he did not hurt her, and then he ushered her back into the cabin, shutting the door behind her. Nebraska commented on women, saying they could be fickle, but the ones who were the most unpredictable were the ones who held a man's attention the longest. He recounted his experience with marriage, saying that whiskey and rattlesnake venom did not make him as bad as a woman could. "There's always something happening when there's a woman around," remarked one of the men. However, the atmosphere grew tense instead of relaxed. Holderness appeared uneasy, as if he was expecting someone from Seeping Springs. Snap Justice leaned against the door, studying the rustlers with a cunning gaze. He had a feeling that something was about to happen, like a hawk spotting its prey from afar. Suddenly, he pushed back against the door and faced the men. "Stop!" commanded Holderness, his voice suddenly changing. "You're not going in there." "I'm taking the girl and riding to White Sage," replied Justice, speaking slowly. "Bah! You're only saying that as an excuse to get into the cabin with her. I stopped you last night, and I'll stop you again. Shut the door, Justice, or something bad will happen." "There's going to be more happening than you think, Holderness. Don't interfere now, I'm going," declared Justice. "Well, go ahead, but you're not taking the girl," Holderness retorted. Snap Justice swung off the step and slammed the door behind him. "So that's why you made me foreman, huh?" he sneered. His hand moved slightly towards his gun, and his pale eyes tried to pierce Holderness's confidence. The rustler chief had a trick up his sleeve, which showed in his sardonic smile. "Justice, you're not getting the girl," he said. "Maybe you'll get her," Snap hissed, his passion driving his hand to draw his Colt. Click, click, click. The hammer fell on empty chambers. "Hell!" he shrieked. Holderness laughed sarcastically. "That's where you're going," he cried. "Here's to Justice's trick with a gun. Bah!" And he shot his foreman through the heart. Snap fell to the ground, his hands beating the ground like the wings of a wounded bird. His fingers gripped the dust, spread convulsively, straightened, and then lay limp. "Holderness!" shouted the man outside Mescal's cabin. "I got rid of your would-be husband. Don't be sad." He then gestured to the unconscious man on the ground and said to those nearby, "One of you drag him out for the coyotes." The first person to approach the fallen man was a rustler from Nebraska. He picked up Snap's gun and checked it, only to find it was empty. He did the same with the second gun and found it was also empty. "No bullets," he exclaimed, looking at the group of silent men. Holderness laughed loudly and used a lasso to lock the cabin door. Langford was still in shock from learning about the plot that had put Mescal in Holderness's control. Even though Snap Justice was a bad man, Langford knew that marrying him would have been better than the fate that awaited Mescal now. Langford was now certain that Holderness and his men were doomed and waited for their fate to unfold. Holderness was sure that his strong band of men would protect him and sat calmly by the campfire. He had no idea that Snap Justice had warned him about the impending danger. However, somewhere on the Oasis Trail there was a man who had turned from saving lives to taking them. He was now as unyielding as death itself and was accompanied by a group of Navajos, fierce desert warriors who were swift as eagles and merciless as wolves. As Langford watched and waited, he felt sorry for Holderness. His end was near. Twice the rustler leader had approached the cabin door as if to enter, but Langford had always aimed his rifle at him, waiting for him to step inside. However, Holderness always stopped himself just in time, causing Langford to ease his finger off the trigger. The night was dark, with a cloudy sky that offered no starlight. The wind picked up, moaning through the cedars. One by one the rustlers wrapped themselves in their blankets and dozed off, while the campfire slowly dwindled. The night wore on with the sound of the wind and far-off coyotes. Langford, unable to sleep, saw one of the rustlers stir. The man rose very carefully and looked at his companions, then gazed at Holderness, who lay exposed in the dying light. The rustler lowered himself back down, but Langford wondered what he was planning to do. After a while, the man lifted his head again and listened intently. His comrades were sound asleep. He slipped out of his blankets and stood up. He moved slowly and quietly, taking his time to stand upright. The rustler moved between his sleeping companions, his stockinged feet making no noise, and headed towards the cabin door. Langford had planned to kill him before he reached the door, but he hesitated. Why was this rustler moving so stealthily, passing Holderness with his gun drawn? The rustler leader was in danger once again. Langford realized that the rustler was a Mormon, loyal to Snap Justice and dedicated to freeing Mescal. Langford prayed silently. What if one of the rustlers woke up? As the rustler turned at the door, his dark face glinted in the flickering light. Quietly, the rustler unwound his lasso and opened the door without making a sound. Langford whispered, "Heavens, if he goes in, she'll scream. That will wake Holderness, then I must shoot, I must." However, the Mormon rustler was wise and added his cunning and stealth. "Hist," he whispered into the cabin. "Hist." Mescal must have been awake. She must have guessed the meaning of the low whisper instantly, for she silently appeared in the doorway, holding out her bound hands. The man untied the bonds and pointed towards the corral in the cedars. Swift and soundless as a flitting shadow, Mescal vanished into the gloom. The Mormon stole back to his bed with wary, unhurried steps and rolled up in his blankets. Langford rose unsteadily, wavering in the hot grip of a moment that seemed to have but one issue: the killing of Holderness. Mescal would soon be upon Silvermane, far out on the White Sage Trail, and this time there would be no sand strip to trap her. But Langford could not kill the rustler while he was sleeping, and he could not awaken him without revealing the escape of the girl. Langford stood there on the bench, gazing down at the blanketed Holderness. Why not kill him now, ending forever his power, and trust to chance for the rest? No, no. Langford flung the temptation from him, to ward off pursuit as long as possible, to aid Mescal in every way to some safe hiding place, and then to seek Holderness. That was the forethought of a man who had learned to wait. Under the dark projection of the upper cliff, Langford felt his way to the cedar slope and the trail. Then he went swiftly down into the little hollow where he had left Topper. The darkness of the forest hindered him, but he came at length to the edge of the aspen thicket. He penetrated it and was guided towards Topper by a suspicious stamp and neigh. He found her and quieted her with a word. As he rode down the hollow and out onto the level valley, the clouds began to break, letting in a pale light through the rifts. The thick gloom that surrounded him made it difficult to see, but he could tell that cattle were lying all around him. The ground was soft under Topper's hooves, making no sound as they rode. Suddenly the Mustang threw up her head, causing Langford to look into the night fog. He heard the sound of rapid hoofbeats and saw a vague gray shadow moving towards him. It was Silvermane, and Langford called out as loudly as he dared. But the stallion disappeared into the mist, and the beating of hoofs softened and ceased. Langford spurred Topper to go faster, but the chase was futile, so he pulled her into a trot. He kept her at that pace for the rest of the night and found the trail at dawn, reaching Seeping Springs shortly after. He saw Silvermane's tracks deep in the clay at the drinking trough and rested for a few moments before continuing on the trail. From the ridge below the spring, he saw Silvermane miles ahead of him. The day passed quickly as he watched the stallion grow smaller and smaller until he disappeared on the looming slope of Coconina. Langford's fear that Mescal would run into Holderness's riders grew less and less after she had reached the cover of the cedars. He was certain that she would rest the stallion at the Navajo pool on the mountain. Late in the night he came to the camping spot and found no trace of her. He tied the tired Mustang and slept until daylight. He crossed the plateau and began the descent, and before he was halfway down, the warm, bright sun had cleared the valley of vapor and shadow. Up ahead on the winding white trail, Langford spotted a speck that he recognized as Silvermane. 10-15 miles, maybe more, he estimated. Hours passed as he traveled, but thoughts of time and fatigue were pushed aside by images of Mescal. He rode into White Sage near sundown, heading straight for Bishop Caldwell's cottage. Matt, one of the bishop's sons, opened the gate for him. "Mescal!" Langford cried. "Safe," replied the Mormon. "Have you hidden her?" "She's in a secret cave, a Mormon hiding place for women. Only a few men know of its existence. Rest easy, for she's absolutely safe." "Thank God. Then that's settled." Langford breathed a sigh of relief. "Mescal told us what happened, how she got caught at the sand strip and escaped from Holderness at Silver Cup. Was Beale hurt?" "Silvermane killed him." "Good God, how things come about. I saw you run Beale down that time here in White Sage. It must have been written. Did Holderness shoot Snap Justice?" "Yes." "What of old Justice? Won't he come down here now to lead us Mormons against the rustlers?" He called the Navajos across the river. He meant to take the trail alone and kill Holderness, keeping the Indians back a few days. If he failed to return, then they were to ride out on the rustlers. But his plan must be changed, for I came ahead of him. "For what, Mescal?" "No, for Holderness." "You'll kill him?" "Yes." "He'll be coming soon? When?" Tomorrow, possibly by daylight. He wants mescal. There's a chance Justice may have reached Silver Cup before Holderness left, but I doubt it. May I know your plan? The Mormon hesitated, then his face lit up with daring inspiration. I have a good reason, Langford said confidently. What's the plan? Asked Mescal. We'll hide Topper and Silvermane in the arbor down in the orchard. I'll stay outside tonight and get some rest, but I'll keep watch in the morning. Holderness and his men will come here to take you away, but they'll try to be sneaky about it. I'll meet him when he comes, that's all, Langford explained. Mescal agreed. It's well. Don't mention this to my father. Come inside, you need food and rest. Later we'll hide Topper and Silvermane in the arbor. Langford arrived at the bishop's home shortly after Mescal, which only added to the family's unease. Despite their reservations, Langford ate his supper in silence. Matt Caldwell did not come to the table, and his brothers left before finishing their meals. Langford spent the night outside wrapped in a blanket, trying to quiet his thoughts and get some sleep. However, the sounds of footsteps, whispers, and gates closing kept him awake. He dreamed of them until he woke up to a clear dawn and the ringing of a bell. Langford's movements were quick and precise as he paced behind the arbor, waiting for Holderness and his men to arrive. The morning was eerily quiet, with no sign of the bishop's sons. A feeling of impending doom hung in the air. Suddenly a group of horsemen appeared on the road, some of them wearing black masks. At the head of the group was Holderness, his red-gold beard glinting in the sunlight. The sound of their horses' hooves and clinking stirrups shattered the morning stillness. Holderness and two of his men dismounted in front of the bishop's gate, while the rest of the group continued down the road. Langford watched from his hiding place behind a green covert as Holderness and his companions strolled up the garden path. Holderness took a cigarette from his lips and blew out rings of smoke. Bishop Caldwell emerged from the cottage, tapping his cane on the porch floor. Holderness greeted him with a polite nod, while the old man fixed his wavering blue eyes on the rustler's belted and spurred form. Just then Langford leapt out from his hiding place, shouting Holderness's name. The rustler spun around in surprise, exclaiming, "Beale's spy!" Fear flickered in his eyes as he faced his foe. Then came wonder, amusement, anger, and finally a sense of impending death. Langford's raised hand suggested that he was there to bring justice, and the rustlers were transfixed by his gaze. Holderness calculated his chances, but Langford's cold, deliberate manner left him feeling helpless. He knew he had been ordered to draw his weapon, but he couldn't summon the courage to do so. The tension was palpable and the outcome uncertain. "Justice's trick," Langford sneered tauntingly. In an instant Holderness lunged for his weapon, but before he could even fully draw it, Langford's hand moved like lightning. A flash of blue, a burst of red, and a deafening crash filled the air. Holderness staggered, his blond head flinging backwards and the amber of his eyes suddenly losing their luster. His lifeless body crumpled to the ground, still clutching at the weapon he had failed to use. Chapter 20. "Get Holderness out of here, and fast," commanded Langford, his gun still smoking. The rustlers, frozen until now, sprang into action, dragging their fallen leader down the garden path with a clinking of spurs and plowing of gravel. "Bishop, go inside. They might come back," Langford instructed, rushing up the steps to support the old man. "Was that Holderness?" he asked. "Yes," Langford replied. "The wicked will receive their due punishment from God." Langford led the bishop inside, where a room full of weeping women and children awaited them. None of the young men were present, and Langford couldn't understand why. He tried to comfort the family, but the women paid him no attention. "Where are your sons?" he asked the bishop. "I don't know," the old man replied. "They should be here to support me. It's strange. Last night they were visited by many men coming and going until late. They didn't sleep in their beds. I don't know what to think." Langford recalled Matt Caldwell's mysterious expression. "Have the rustlers really come?" a tear-stained young woman asked. "Yes, all 19 of them," Langford confirmed. She burst into tears again, and the rest of the family joined in. Langford left the cottage, grabbing his rifle before making his way down to the horse's hiding spot in the orchard. Silvermane greeted him with a joyful prance and snort. The Desert King was built for a grueling race. Black Topper grazed quietly on the long grass. Langford saddled the stallion, making sure he was ready at a moment's notice before returning to the front of the yard. Suddenly the sound of a gun echoed down the road, followed by several more shots in quick succession. A distant angry murmuring and the trampling of many feet drew Langford to the gate. He saw riderless mustangs galloping down the road while several frightened boys ran across the square. Not a single man was in sight. The sound of 3 more shots cracked through the air, and the low murmur and trampling turned into a hoarse uproar. Langford recognized the tumultuous sound of mob violence, and his heart sank. A dense throng of men appeared in the main street, crowding toward the square. The procession had some order, led and flanked by mounted men, but the upflinging of many arms, the craning of necks, and the leaping of men on the outskirts of the mass, the pressure inward and the hideous roar, proclaimed its real character. "By God!" exclaimed Langford, "the Mormons have risen against the rustlers. I understand now. Matt Caldwell spent last night secretly rousing his neighbors. They have surprised the rustlers. Now what?" Langford vaulted the fence and ran down the road. A compact mob of men, 100 or more, had halted in the village under the wide-spreading cottonwoods. Langford suddenly grasped the terrible significance of those outstretched branches, and out of the thought grew another which made him run at a breakneck speed. "Open up! Let me in!" he yelled to the thickly thronged circle. Right and left he pushed men aside. "Make way!" His piercing voice stilled the angry murmur. Fierce men with weapons held aloft fell back from his face. "Beale's spy!" they cried. The circle opened and closed upon him. He saw bound rustlers under armed guard. 4 still forms were on the ground. Holderness lay outstretched, a dark red blot staining his gray shirt. The Mormons, once known for their mildness, now wore flinty faces and were ruthless. They had surrounded the rustlers, with Matt Caldwell leading the charge. His lips broke into a bitter speech, accusing the man in front of him of being Beale's spy and the killer of Holderness. The listeners proclaimed him their leader in war. Langford asked what the game was, and Caldwell replied that they would have a fair trial for the rustlers, and then they would be hanged. However, Caldwell added that there were 2 men who had befriended him, and he would not see them hanged. The crowd demanded he pick them out. Langford asked Nebraska to step forward, but the rustler denied any wrongdoing. He had never seen Langford before and was not the kind of person to cheat anyone. Langford accused him of untying the girl's hands, and Nebraska denied it until Langford offered to save his life if he would quit rustling cattle and work for him instead. Nebraska agreed, and Langford cut him loose from the others. Langford then demanded that the masked rustlers remove their masks, but they refused. Caldwell seemed to be in pain, and Langford realized that he couldn't recognize the other man. However, Mescal could tell who he was since he had saved her life. The rustlers all clamored to be the one to be saved, except for the masked ones who remained silent and stern. Caldwell whispered to Langford to hurry back home and fetch Mescal. Time was pressing, and the Mormons were wavering. "You only have a few minutes," Langford said as he slipped out of the crowd, running up the road and jumping over the fence before bursting into the bishop's home. "Don't worry, there's no danger. The rustlers have been captured. I need Mescal. Quick, where is she? Someone fetch her." One of the women left the room, and Langford heard the clicking of a latch and the closing of a door. He then heard hollow footfalls descending on stone, followed by swiftly pattering footsteps. Mescal came through the hall like a whirlwind, her black hair flying and dark eyes beaming. "My darling!" Langford exclaimed, oblivious to the Mormons, as he swung her up and held her in his arms. "Mescal! Mescal!" Once he put her down, Langford said, "Listen, Mescal, be calm. I'm safe. The rustlers are prisoners. One of them released you from Holderness. Tell me which one." "I don't know," Mescal replied. "I've tried to think. I didn't see his face, and I can't remember his voice." "Think! He'll be hanged if you don't recall something to identify him. He deserves a chance. Holderness's crowd are thieves and murderers, but 2 were not all bad. That showed the night you were at Silver Cup. I saved Nebraska." "Were you at Silver Cup?" "Jack," Mescal interrupted. "Hush, don't interrupt me. We must save this man who saved you. Think, Mescal, think." "I can't. What should I remember?" Mescal asked. "Something about him. Think of his coat, his sleeve. You must remember something. Did you see his hands?" Langford inquired. "Yes, I did when he was loosing the cords," Mescal said eagerly. "Long, strong fingers, I felt them too. He has a sharp, rough wart on one hand, I don't know which. He wears a leather wristband." "That's enough," Langford exclaimed as he bounded out onto the garden walk and raced back to the crowded square. The uneasy circle stirred and opened for him to enter. As he made his way back to the group, he stumbled over a pile of lassos that definitely had not been there before. The group of stoic Mormons stood still while the rustlers coughed and shifted their feet. Matt Caldwell's face turned gray as Langford bent down to examine the 3 dead rustlers lying with Holderness. After a moment of anxious scrutiny, he stood up to confront the line of prisoners. "Put out your hands," he ordered. One by one they complied. But the 6th rustler, a tall figure completely masked, refused to do as he was told. Langford spoke twice more, but the rustler twisted his bound hands under his coat. "Let's see them," Langford said quickly, grasping the fellow's arm. The rustler pushed him violently, almost knocking him over. Langford grappled with the rustler, pulling up the bound hands despite fierce resistance. There were the long fingers, the sharp wart, and the laced wristband. "Here's my man," he exclaimed. "No," the rustler mumbled hoarsely. The perspiration ran down his corded neck, and his breast heaved convulsively. "You fool," cried Langford in disbelief. "I recognized you. Would you rather hang than live? What's your secret?" He snatched off the black mask. The bishop's eldest son stood revealed. "Good God!" cried Langford, recoiling from that convulsed face. "Brother! Oh, I feared this," groaned Matt Caldwell. The rustlers broke out into curses and harsh laughter. "You Mormons, see him, Paul Caldwell, son of a bishop. Thought he was shepherding sheep." "D&U Langford," shouted the guilty Mormon in passionate fury and shame. "Why didn't you hang me? Why didn't you bury me unknown?" "Caldwell, I can't believe it," cried Langford, slowly coming to himself. "But you don't hang. Here, come out of the crowd. Make way, men." The silent crowd of Mormons with lowered and averted eyes made passage for Langford and Caldwell. Then cold, stern voices in sharp questions and orders went on with the grim trial. Leading the beaten and bruised Mormon, Langford moved to the side of the town hall and turned his back on the crowd. The constant sound of many feet trampling and the mix of many voices created a deafening noise. However, the sound gradually faded and a long silence followed. Suddenly an outcry broke the silence. "The Navajos! The Navajos!" Langford's heart raced at the cry, and he looked towards the eastern end of the village road, where a group of mounted Indians, 4 abreast, was riding towards the square. "Justice and his Indians!" Langford shouted. "Justice and his Indians, no need to fear." His words were timely because the Mormons, who were unaware of Justice's pursuit and afraid of hostile Navajos, were handling their guns ominously. But then recognition dawned. August Justice. The band rode on, with Justice leading on his spotted roan. The mustangs were exhausted and covered in foam. Justice reined in his horse, and the keen-eyed Navajos closed in behind him. The old Mormon's sharp eyes scanned the dark forms hanging from the cottonwoods to the files of waiting men. "Where is he?" he asked. "There," Matt Caldwell answered, pointing to the body of Holderness. "Who robbed me of my vengeance? Who killed the rustler?" Justice's voice was loud and powerful, filled with a hunger of thwarted hate that held men silent. He bent down to gaze at the dead Holderness, as if to make sure of the ghastly reality. Then he appeared to rise in his saddle, and his broad chest expanded. "I know what I saw. I was blind not to believe my own eyes. Where is he? Where is Langford?" Someone pointed Langford out. Justice swung from his saddle, scattering the men before him as if they were sheep. His shaggy gray head and massive shoulders towered above the tallest man there. Langford felt a cold sense of fear wash over him. He grew weak in his entire being. The gray, shaggy man grabbed Langford by the shoulder, causing him to stagger. Langford couldn't believe it. Was this really his kind Mormon benefactor? The man's eyes were filled with fury. "You killed Holderness?" he bellowed. Langford nodded, barely audible. "You heard me say I'd go alone. You forestalled me. You took upon yourself my work. Speak," Justice demanded. "I did," Langford whispered. "By what right?" Justice demanded. "My debt, duty to your family, Dave," Langford exclaimed. "Boy, boy, you've robbed me," Justice shouted, motioning to the rustlers hanging nearby. "You've led these white-livered Mormons to do my work. How can I avenge my 7 sons?" He was like an old desert lion, consumed with rage. He let go of Langford and walked over to Holderness, raising his fists. 18 years I prayed for wicked men," he said. "One by one I buried my sons. I gave my springs and my cattle. Then I yielded to the lust for blood. I renounced my religion. I paid my soul to everlasting hell for the life of my foe. But he's dead, killed by a wild boy. I sold myself to the devil for nothing." August Justice's anger was palpable, and the crowd was silent as he raged. The ferocity of the desert spirit spoke silently in the hanging rustlers, in the ruthlessness of the vigilantes who had destroyed them, but it spoke truest in the sonorous roll of the old Mormon's wrath. "August, young Langford saved 2 of the rustlers," an old friend spoke up, hoping to divert the angry flood. "Paul Caldwell there, he was one of them. The other's gone." Justice loomed over him. "What?" he roared. His friend edged away, repeating his words and jerking his thumb backward toward the bishop's son. "Judas Iscariot," thundered Justice, "false to thyself, thy kin, and thy God. Thrice traitor, why didn't you get yourself killed? Why are you left?" "Oh, how I long for a rustler to take down with my own hands," exclaimed Langford. "Give me a rope." Caldwell, in the grip of Justice, hoarsely begged for the noose. Langford pleaded with Justice, using all his strength to stop the Mormon's iron grip. "Justice, please listen. He saved Mescal. This man, thief, traitor, false Mormon, whatever he may be, saved Mescal," he cried. Justice's eyes were red with rage. He flung Langford off with one shake of his body and dragged Caldwell across the grass to the cottonwood tree as if he weighed nothing at all. Suddenly Langford pointed down the square and cried, "August! August! Look!" The old bishop was making his way over, leaning on his cane and shielding his eyes with his hand. "August, the bishop is coming. Paul's father, do you hear?" Langford pleaded. Justice's mind was consumed with fury, but Langford's words broke through the haze. Justice saw the bishop pause and stare at the dark shapes hanging from the cottonwoods, and he knew he couldn't let him see his son's guilt. He released his grip on Caldwell, and his face transformed. "Paul, it's your father, the bishop," he said, his voice breaking. "Be a man. He must never know." Justice addressed the crowd. "Listen, men," he said. "As a Mormon I have lost the most, suffered the most. Bishop Caldwell must never know of his son's guilt. He would be destroyed by the knowledge. Keep this secret. Paul will become a man again, I know, I see. For Mormons, August Justice has the gift of revelation." Chapter 21. The oasis was bathed in the warm glow of summer sunshine, casting golden gleams on the glistening red walls surrounding it. White clouds, resembling sails on a deep blue sea, cast shadows on the vast alfalfa fields. Smoke billowed from chimneys, spiraling high above the cottonwood trees and hovering in the still air. The Navajo blankets draped over the grove added a vibrant pop of desert-red color to the scene. The scene was bustling with activity as the half-naked bronze Indians lounged around the cabin porches and stood in idle groups. They were dressed in peaceful attire, with a black-tipped white eagle feather adorning each of their black heads. The children played merrily while Silvermane grazed under the shady trees, being caressed by many a sinewy red hand. Black Topper neighed jealously from the corral, and the other mustangs kicked and whistled across the bars. The peacocks preened their feathers and let out their clarion calls, while the belligerent turkey gobblers ruffled their feathers. The blackbirds and swallows sang and twittered their happiness, finding their old nests in the branches and under the eaves. The dull roar of the Colorado in flood boomed over everything as it was the morning of Mescal's wedding day. August Justice sat astride a peeled log of driftwood in the lane with Langford standing beside him. 5,000 steers, lad. Why do you refuse them? They're worth $10 a head today in Salt Lake City. A good start for a young man, said August, who was without a task for once. No, I'm still in your debt, replied Langford. Then share alike with my sons in work and profit? Yes, I can accept that, Langford agreed. Good. Jack, I see happiness and prosperity for you. Do you remember that night on the White Sage Trail? Ah, well, the worst is over. We can look forward to better times. It's not likely the rustlers will ride into Utah again, but this desert will never be free from strife, August said. Tell me of Mescal, Langford asked. Ah, yes, I'm coming to that, August replied as he bent his head over the log and chipped off little pieces with his knife. Jack, will you come into the Mormon church? Langford had always avoided this question, knowing that it would inevitably come up, and he answered it as bravely as he could. No, August, I can't, he replied. "Those cowboys are back," said Langford. "Cowboys!" exclaimed Justice. "I hope they haven't come for trouble." Langford stepped to the door and called to the approaching men. They rode up dusty and hot, and their faces were dark with anger. "Are you Langford?" asked one, a tall, raw-boned fellow with a red mustache. "Yes, I am," replied Langford courteously. "We want that Indian girl," shouted the cowboy fiercely. "You can't have her," said Langford firmly. "Why not?" "Because she is under my protection. We don't care who she is under. She belongs to us." "What do you mean?" "We mean she's stolen our burros and run off with them." "That can't be true," said Langford incredulously. "It is true," yelled the cowboy, his face growing redder. "And we want her." "You can't have her," repeated Langford. "She is under my protection. I will investigate this matter, and if it is true, I will make restitution. But you can't take the law into your own hands." The cowboys muttered among themselves, and then one of them spoke up. "We'll give you until tomorrow to make restitution. If you don't, we'll come back and get her." "I'll see that you get your burros back," said Langford calmly. "You better," growled the cowboy as they rode off. As a little gray burro trotted along the red wall, Langford recognized him as Noddle. Langford called to Mescal, who was shy and reserved, to come out and see her wedding present. Mescal rushed out with joy and tears in her eyes, falling to her knees and embracing Noddle. Justice married Mescal and Langford under the cottonwoods with Eshta and many others in attendance. The ceremony was brief and ended with a prayer for the couple's marriage. As the Mormon family congratulated the newlyweds, children ran around throwing flowers, and Navajos danced and sang. The feast was spread out under the shade of the cottonwoods, and everyone enjoyed the warm afternoon. When the time came, the chief Eshta stood up and blessed the couple. He praised their youth and strength and wished them a happy life together. Jack and Mescal mounted their horses, and with Paiute leading the pack burros and Wolf running ahead, they began their ascent up the plateau trail. Twilight fell as they reached the old camp, and they watched the sunset over the painted desert. Paiute tended to the campfire while Wolf kept a watchful eye on Mescal. Langford, too, couldn't help but watch her as she seemed to radiate the spirit of the desert. The sound of Silvermane's hooves, now hobbled, echoed through the darkness. Topper's bell had a melodic jingle to it. The sheep were bleating, and a coyote's howl could be heard in the distance. The white stars flickered in the blue sky, and the gentle night breeze rustled through the cedar trees. The end. This concludes Desert Bloodline, a Western novel, written by Ken Cannon. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer.